Bonsoir. Welcome to the newcomers and welcome back for the others. Today we'll go with chapter 21 of The Siege of Macindaw, Ranger Apprentice, Book 6. Here we go. Trobor led the little party along a typical Grimsdale track, narrow, constricted, and overgrown. It wound its way beneath the massive trees that loomed above it. At ground level, the track was barely 2 meters wide. Above the ground, the canopy of the forest overhung the track, the branches and vines intertwining to block out the view of the stars. At odd intervals, they passed arcane symbols and warning signs, skulls and bones figuring prominently amongst them. MacHaddish seemed unperturbed by this, although they caused a certain amount of nervous comment from the three Scandians. More ominous to Will was the fact that the forest was completely silent. There was no rustling of nocturnal animals among the undergrowth, no soft, swishing flight of bats or owls through the trees, nothing. And yet the silence did not suggest the absence of life. Far from it. In fact, there was a sense of some large presence around them, of eyes that watched them from the impenetrable darkness that beckoned outside the narrow circle of light from the torches they carried. The forest itself seemed to personify a massive, ancient evil. Will shivered at the thought of it and pulled his cloak more tightly around him. The darkness and the silence were causing him to have fanciful thoughts, he told himself. There was nothing here to be afraid of. He knew that the manifestation he had seen and heard when he first entered the forest had been the result of Malcolm's trickery, and yet the forest had been ancient long before Malcolm had come to live in. Who could tell what prehistoric evil might have taken root here, deep under the trees, where the warning, cleansing light of the sun never penetrated? He glanced surreptitiously at Horace, marching beside him. In the light of the torch he carried, Horace's face was pale and set. He could feel the atmosphere too, Will thought. They wound through the trees. Trobor walked at the front of the party, with MacHaddish behind him. The giant had levered MacHaddish's chain free of the logs that had secured him through the night, and stapled it to a slightly smaller log. Trobor now carried it by one hand, as if it were weightless. But Horace and Will both realized that its weight would take all the strength of a normal man to lift. It was simply to ensure that MacHaddish didn't try to escape. All Trobor had to do was drop the massive piece of hardwood, and MacHaddish's progress will be reduced to a staggering crawl. The three Scandians followed directly behind the Scottish general, their weapons ready for any sign of treachery on his part, and for any supernatural interference that might manifest itself in the meantime. Will and Horace brought up the rear. "How far is the clearing?" Horace asked quietly. The darkness of the forest was becoming oppressive. It seemed to press in on them, and he would have welcomed the sight of a patch of clear sky and a little room around him to let him breathe. Will shrugged. He said it was close by, but the way this trail twists and winds, we could be walking for miles. At the sound of their voices, muted as they were, Trobor turned to look back at them. He placed his finger to his lips in an unmistakable sign for silence. Will and Horace exchanged a glance and shrugged, but they said nothing. A few meters farther, Trobor held up his hand and they all stopped. He peered from side to side into the blackness, holding his torch higher to try to penetrate farther into the gloomy depth surrounded them. Instinctively, the other members of the little party copied his actions. For the first time, Will noticed that Macadash had lost his customary lack of concern. His glance flicked quickly from Trobor to the surrounding darkness and back again. The man has some nerves, after all, Will thought to himself. The Scandians muttered in an undertone until Trobor rounded on them fiercely and made the gesture for silence again. He started forward, then stopped, uncertainly. His nervousness communicated itself to the rest of the group. Will felt an overwhelming sense that something was coming up on him in the darkness behind them. But when he turned quickly to look, he could see nothing but blackness beyond the flare of his torch. Then the sound began. It was a deep, rhythmic noise, the sound of some massive creature's breathing. It came from the side and from behind. Then it was ahead of them. Then to the right. The hair on Will's neck prickled upright. It's the forest itself, he thought. It's alive. He shook himself angrily to get rid of the ridiculous fancy. He knew how Malcolm arranged for sons to move around the forest. The healer had shown him the network of hollow tubes he used to broadcast and amplify sounds to different positions. Somewhere out in the dark, Will told himself, Luke Malcolm's barrel-chested assistant will be breathing into the tubes, sending the sounds through a network of tubes to different points in the trees around them. Then the breathing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Trobor stepped off again, Macadash and the three Scandians following reluctantly. Will realized, in a flash of inspiration, that the giant's reluctance and uncertainty were pretense. It was Brian play-acting on his part, pretending to be nervous, pretending to be uncertain as to whether to carry on or not. As Malcolm had told him, fear communicates itself to others. The fact that the massive gargoyle-like Trobor was afraid was enough to make the others fearful as well. Trobor stopped again. Then he turned his head from side to side, listening. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere. The breathing was gone, replaced now by deep sighing sound, an extended visceral growl that was right at the lower register of human hearing. Trobor looked back at the small party, his eyes wide with fear. "Hurry!" he croaked at them, and then, in case they hadn't understood him, set off along the track at a shambling run. Macadish was caught by surprise and remained rooted to the spot for a second or two. Then, the chain leading to the collar around his neck tightened and nearly jerked him from his feet. He recovered with difficulty, staggering and blundering into trees as he tried to regain his balance, knowing that if he lost his footing, trouble would not wait for him. He would be dragged along by the chain until the collar choked him. The Scandians needed no extra urging. They carried behind the reeling general, shoving him with their weapons, exhorting him to go faster or to make way for them. Will and Horace, after a moment's indecision, took off in pursuit, stumbling on roots and depressions in the uneven track, the flames from their torches flaring behind them, trailing showers of sparks as they tried to keep up. Will told himself that it was all a trick, an illusion. He knew that Malcolm and a party of his followers had been at work all day preparing for this. Yet, even so, while logic told him there was nothing to be frightened of, his sense of terror in these cold, dark woods could not be denied. The groaning had changed. It had become a guttural laugh, as the forest seemed to express its contempt for their efforts to escape. Ahead of them, Trouble's hoarse, slurring voice could be heard as he continued to exhort them to hurry. Will glanced back over his shoulder, but with the glare of the torch beside his head, he couldn't see more than a meter or two behind him. Again, he had a sense of unavoidable dread, the feeling that something large and hostile was looming in the night behind him. His feet caught in a tree root, and he pitched forward, but before he reached the ground, he felt Horace's hand grab his upper arm and drag him upright again. "Watch where you're going!" The fear was infectious. Will sensed in Horace's pitch voice. Horace saw it in Will's fearful backward glances. Each of them had the highest regard for the other's courage, so the thought that Horace was terrified added spurs to Will's fear, and vice versa for Horace. The night, the darkness, the narrow, winding track all magnified their fear, and it fed upon the oldest fear of all, fear of the dark unknown. Now the voice in the night had changed again. The laughter had changed to a pulsing, wordless snarl. It was a sound that mingled frustration with hatred, that told them beyond doubt that whatever was out there in the forest was weary of toying with them and was about to close in for the kill. And then, blessedly, there was light and open space as they blundered into the clearings they had been searching for, and the sounds of the forest gradually died away. The little party stood, head changing, chest heaving, as they recovered their breath. The clearing was barely 20 meters across, but they could see the night sky above them and feel relief from the strengthening wall of trees that had enclosed them. There was a small fire burning in the center of the clearing. After the oppressive blackness of the forest, it seemed twice as bright as normal, and instinctively, seeing it as a sanctuary, they moved toward it, Then a figure stepped into the light, between them and the fire. One hand up, in an unmistakable gesture, his shadow long and wavering in the flickering light of fire. The figure was tall and narrow-shouldered, dressed in a long black gown that was festooned with gold thread tracing out the shape of the moon and stars and comets. A high, flat-topped tubular had crowned his head, with a narrow brim circling it about 10 centimeters above its base. The hat was bright burnished silver, and it caught the red glare of the fire, throwing weird dancing reflections of light into the trees around them with every slight movement of his head. His face was painted in alien patterns of black and silver, completely covered so that only the eye were left glaring out from the terrifying mask. The figure held out his hands to the side, and Will could see that the arm of the long garment he wore were flared at the cuffs, so the sleeves hung like bat's wings from his arms. And his voice, when he spoke, was harsh and querulous, a voice that would brook no argument. Gone was Malcolm, the gentler healer Will had come to know. In his place was the character he had created to keep intruders away from Grinda's wood. Malacham, Will realized, the sorcerer. That's the end of chapter 21, folks. I hope there wasn't too much background noises. If there was, I redo it later on. Also, I've tried to speak more slowly. If you could tell me if it's any better or if it's worse, you understood better or less, please just notify me. Well, I guess see you soon.